Welcome to Subclass Series, a playlist of videos where I plan to break down each and every subclass one by one down to the fundamentals, going over all of the verbs, buffs, synergies, as well as some niche features for each subclass that you might not even know about. And I pose this question to you: how well do you really know each subclass? This video is mainly targeted at beginners and intermediate players, as well as new players who want to finally understand subclasses so that you can come up with your own builds without having to wait for content creators. Or maybe you want to find a way to take your team's DPS from a 3-phase to a 2-phase. Whatever the case, I'm hoping through this series I can teach you something, even if the takeaway is that you already know everything. And with that said, please correct me in the comments. I'm human, I make mistakes, but if I have, I want to be corrected. I could have missed something, tested something wrong, or I might have simply just misunderstood a mechanic. Please keep me accountable and let me know. I read every single one of the comments on my videos, good or bad. Now let's get into it. This week I'm starting with Arc, one of the light subclasses, one of the original 3 base subclasses in Destiny 1, where it all began. It's come a long way since the beginning. Warlocks didn't even have an Arc subclass when Destiny launched. Fancy that. Tickle Fingers, the equilibrium boss mechanic, wouldn't exist without Arc Warlocks. Arc to this day remains one of the best across the board classes, with strong ad clear and DPS options across all 3 classes. Titans get one of the best supers for boss damage, Warlocks have great ad clear potential, and Hunters get to stand there and dominate PvP. But what makes Arc so strong? Well, let's start with the verbs. Arc actually has 4 main verbs and an elemental pickup. These are Jolted, Blinded, Amplified, and Bolt Charge. Yes, Bolt Charge is considered a verb. And the elemental pickup is Ionic Traces. These 4 verbs make up 90% of the Arc subclass synergy, and to understand each, you need to know whether it's a buff or a debuff to the enemy. And my trivia question for this video is which of the classes can actually get Bolt Charge? So let's go over the debuffs first. We have Jolted and Blinded. As the name debuff implies, these affect the enemy, usually hindering or damaging them. They can be applied in a variety of ways, and they are really strong to the point where they've actually been nerfed multiple times since being introduced. So let's start with Jolt. This is primarily an ad cleared debuff. When dealing a certain amount of damage to a jolted target, that target will release a surge of arc energy, damaging itself and nearby combatants. This is an extremely effective tool for ad clear because there are even occasions when it looks like it just goes straight through walls. The range of Jolt is roughly 12 meters, and the way Jolt works is it's like a threshold. When dealing damage, the meter builds, and when you deal enough damage, it causes the arc to spread, jolting the target, as the name implies. Inherently, Jolt also staggers overload champions whenever they take Jolt damage, but only when they take damage. Simply having the debuff does not trigger overload. You must make the target jolt for the champion to stun. Now when applied, Jolt will last for 10 seconds, and the source of the jolt, whether it's from an ability or a weapon, doesn't change how long they're affected. Everything that applies Jolt will always be 10 seconds. You can reset the timer by reapplying Jolt, but if you do not reapply it, then it will eventually dissipate from the enemy, regardless of whether you're constantly damaging them or not. Now how do you apply Jolt? There are 2 main ways, usually via abilities and fragments, or via weapons. Sometimes you get artifact perks, but I'm not going to talk about artifacts in this because they change from season to season. To determine if something applies Jolt, the easiest way to know is by reading the description. This will work 90% of the time, but once you start mixing exotics and artifacts, it can get really confusing. At base, the Arc subclass can apply Jolt from any grenade when the fragment Spark of Discharge is equipped, from the Warlock melee Chain Lightning, and from supers like Gathering Storm, Chaos Reach, and Storm Trance. But if we include aspects and fragments, then Warlocks have Lightning Surge, which applies Jolt. 3 out of the 4 Hunter aspects can apply Jolt in some way, and Titans have Touch of Thunder, which allows lightning grenades to jolt even without the fragment. The only other fragment that can apply Jolt is Spark of Ions, which requires your health to be low. And bear in mind that all of the turrets from Warlock count as grenades, so they benefit from anything that mentions grenades. The alternative way to apply Jolt is via weapon perks or exotic weapons. The 2 easiest ways are via Volt Shot and jolting feedback, and both of these perks can roll on a ton of legendary arc weapons. As for exotic weapons, I'm just going to rapid fire down the list that play into Jolt. First we have Edge of Concurrence, the Hunter exotic glaive from the Witch Queen DLC. When you special reload and fire the Lightning Seeker, it will chase after an enemy and apply Jolt to the first enemy that it hits. Lodestar, the primary trace rifle, will apply Jolt on hit when shot in overcharged hipfire mode. Darcy of all things will apply Jolt whenever you deal any kind of damage with this gun, which makes it a really easy source of Jolt. And lastly, Two-Tailed Fox, the rocket that got Jolt nerfed the very first time. When you have the catalyst for this gun, the third rocket fired will apply Jolt on impact. We also have a bunch of exotic armor pieces that let you apply Jolt as well. Point Contact Brace lets Thunderclap Jolt for Titans, as well as ACD Feedback Fence, which jolts when the exotic perk triggers. Lucky Raspberry will make Arc Bolt grenades jolt by default for Hunters, and Warlocks don't get anything to allow them to jolt more frequently. Now moving on to the second arc debuff, we have Blind. It functions in a very similar way to Jolt since they're both debuffs. However, this debuff is for crowd control and not ad clear, and I think it's important to distinguish between these two terms. Crowd control, as the name implies, just controls a lot of ads, typically freezing or stunning or stopping them in their place. It doesn't necessarily mean it's good at killing them. Putting them in a position to be killed, maybe, but being good at crowd control doesn't mean good at ad clear. Now, Blind is easier to understand if we break it down into two specific features, the red aura and Disorient. The red aura appears above an enemy that is currently under the effect of Blind. This will last for the entire duration of the debuff, so you will know when something is affected because you can visually see this. The second part of this debuff is the disorientating effect. While debuffed by Blind, most enemies will be disoriented, causing them to stop shooting while affected by the debuff. But it's important to know that Disorient is not Blind. There are disorienting grenades on a lot of special grenade launchers which do the exact same thing as Arc Blind. But because it's not an Arc debuff, it doesn't provide benefits to Arc verbs and Arc synergy. Now, something I haven't mentioned yet is that when you apply Blind, it can stun unstoppable champions, but only when you apply the debuff. Unstops won't stun just because they're debuffed, it only happens as you apply or reapply Blind. And remember, disorienting grenades can't stun unstoppables because it is different to Blind. Now moving on, some enemies can't be disoriented at all. Typically it's bosses and named enemies or champions, the big dudes in strikes. However, they can still be debuffed for the sake of subclass synergy. If you try to blind something and you see the red aura, then they're debuffed, whether they're covering their eyes or not. So if you have fragments or aspects that rely on blinding or killing blind targets, they will still continue to work even against targets who don't stop shooting. Blind doesn't actually have that many ways of being applied compared to the other arc verbs. You have Flashbang Grenades available on all three classes, and it has the second shortest cooldown available out of all of the grenades. On Warlocks, there's Ionic Sentry, which is almost like a better Flashbang Grenade because it blinds when thrown, and then it starts dealing damage. For Titans, Seismic Strike applies blind on impact and Fist of Havoc blinds whenever you perform a heavy attack. I didn't know that until I started testing. And lastly for Hunters, there's Disorienting Blow, which blinds multiple enemies when you perform a melee. The Arc Staff super at the end of the 3-hit combo or when performing an aerial slam also applies blind. And the Lethal Current aspect triggers blind whenever you melee a jolted enemy. As far as I know, there aren't any legendary weapon perks that can apply blind. There's only exotic weapons and some exotic armor pieces. For weapons, we have Centrifuge, the Arc Auto Rifle. When at 100% charge, kills will trigger an explosion which causes blind. Lodestar could trigger a blinding explosion when you get an ADS kill on an Arc debuffed enemy. The Touch of Malice Special Reload Taken Blast is actually considered Arc damage and will blind enemies on hit. The Tessellation Special Reload while an Arc Grenade is equipped will cause the next shot to trigger a blinding explosion. The Grand Overture Missile Volley applies blind on impact. And funnily enough, Queensbreaker, using the Marksman sight, the one that chains lightning, blinds anything that it damages. For exotic armor pieces, we have Chromatic Fire, which will cause a blinding explosion when an arc super is equipped. Vesper of Radius will cause your Rift to constantly emit blinding shockwaves while an arc super is equipped. And hunters have Mothkeeper Wrath, which turns your grenade into moths, and one of them causes a blind effect when it explodes. I think it's also good to add here that Bombardiers and Helm of Saint 14 do not blind. Even though they both say the word blind, it's actually disorient instead, so it does not synergize with anything. Alright, so now that I've covered all of the arc debuffs, and hopefully now you understand how they actually work, let me cover the buffs, starting with Amplified. This is one of the more impactful subclass verbs across the entire game. When you are amplified, you gain a number of benefits. Increased mobility, increased slide distance, increased reload, increased handling, you gain damage resistance against all enemies, and they're less accurate when targeting you, making it extremely strong in endgame content. Now, if you sprint for roughly 2.5 seconds while amplified, you will gain the speed booster buff. This further improves the mobility benefits of amplified, and I have been told that the speed booster also provides an additional 15% damage resistance that additively stacks with amplified, but I haven't been able to test this concretely, so I'm not 100% confident in saying that. To gain amplified, there's one of two ways when running the arc subclass. The first way is through something that I didn't even know about until after I started testing, and that is that there is an intrinsic arc subclass feature. Through somewhat rapid arc kills, you can gain amplified without any subclass setup whatsoever. All you have to do is progress a hidden tracker or progress bar. Red enemies give 25% per kill, yellow bars give 50%, and mini bosses give 100%. Meaning you can gain amplified without any build crafting purely by running an arc subclass or arc super. And a neat little feature is that filling the threshold a second time while you already have amplified will just reset the buff, allowing you to gain the benefits of amplified through a single arc weapon. The other way to get amplified is by taking advantage of fragments and aspects within the arc subclass. Spark of Volts will grant you amplified through finishes, Disorienting Blow on hunters grants amplified on hit, Knockout will give amplified on melee kill, and Electrostatic Mind will grant amplified whenever you collect an Ionic Trace. But that's not all. The Hunter Aspect Flow State will give amplified if you defeat a jolted target, while Lightning Surge and Ascension grant amplified simply on use of the ability. But the most important thing about amplified is that some abilities and fragments are enhanced while you are amplified, often making them absolutely insane. Take Arc Souls for example. At base, they shoot 3-round bursts of arc damage, but while amplified, it shoots 5 rounds at a time. Other abilities that gain increased benefits include both Warlock melee abilities and Seismic Strike on Titan. The aspects that get enhanced are Juggernaut on Titan and Flow State on Hunters, and finally Spark of Frequency, which increases bolt charge gained when amplified. So it's often really beneficial to build into amplified regardless of what your arc build is. Not that it's very difficult to do since amplified is the more prominent arc buff, which lets me segue quite nicely right into bolt charge as our last arc verb. Originally when verbs were introduced, bolt charge didn't exist. We've only had bolt charge for a little over a year now, and it was strongly the meta when it was introduced. Bolt charge effectively has 2 states, charging and ready. The hardest part for most builds is gaining 1 stack of bolt charge. There are a few ways to achieve it, but you have to deliberately build into this to gain that first stack, either through weapon perks, fragments, or aspects. Now once you've got any amount of bolt charge, even just 1, will make damage from any weapon slowly increase your bolt charge stacks. The maximum stacks is 10, and this is what I call the charging state, the process of going from 1 to 10. And once you reach the maximum bolt charge stacks, the buff quite literally says bolt charge ready. This indicates that the next instance of ability damage will discharge the lightning strike, dealing a substantial amount of damage and resetting your stacks of bolt charge back down to 0. This is any ability damage, including ability damage that leaves DOT, such as Unravel or Scorch. I won't be covering this concept in detail in this video, but Jolt damage doesn't remember if it was applied from an ability or weapon, but some other subclass verbs do, like Scorch, meaning Jolt applied by abilities won't trigger bolt charge, but Scorch does. So if an enemy is scorched by an ability, when you get to bolt charge ready, that lingering scorch damage will trigger the bolt charge. Now, a niche little piece of knowledge about Bolt Charge is every time you gain a stack of Bolt Charge, you also gain a small amount of melee energy. It's really small. I think the actual number is like 2%. So it's not a whole lot, but over a whole Bolt Charge rotation, that's roughly 20%. And if you have a really good Bolt Charge rotation, you could take off 40 to 60% of your melee regen. But I feel I'm getting a little bit too detailed now. So to summarize Bolt Charge one more time, gain a stack, deal weapon damage to charge to times 10, and then deal ability damage to release it. Simple. Now, how do you gain Bolt Charge? There are a couple of ways to earn Bolt Charge using fragments. We have Spark of Discharge, which grants a stack of Bolt Charge when you collect an Ionic Trace. Spark of Frequency will give you an extra stack of Bolt Charge whenever you gain Bolt Charge some other way. Spark of Momentum gives you 3 stacks of Bolt Charge when sliding over ammo. And Spark of Volts gives a stack of Bolt Charge when you get a finisher. Now, to earn Bolt Charge via abilities, Hunters have Disorienting Blow once again, which gives 2 Bolt Charge on hit. Titans have Ballistic Slam, which gives 3 Bolt Charge per enemy hit. And the Storm's Keep aspect, which allows Titan barricades to constantly give Bolt Charge while standing behind the barricades. Storm's Keep is actually really good because it allows weapons to discharge Bolt Charge, not just ability damage, when you stand behind them. Finally, Warlocks have Ionic Sentry, which gives 1 stack of Bolt Charge on every hit, and then they also have Lightning Surge, which gives 1 stack on use if you have none, or it can give more based on the number of enemies hit by lightning after that. Now that covers all of the buffs and debuffs available with the Arc subclass, leaving just Ionic Traces to explain. I've already mentioned them a couple of times now, but Ionic Traces are the elemental pickups for Arc. These are little tiny Arc Seekers that travel towards the player along the ground when created, and when collected, give some ability energy to all of your uncharged abilities. If generated for other players as well as yourself, Ionic Traces are player specific, so everyone can collect their own Ionic Trace without stealing yours. Spark of Discharge and Spark of Ions are the only fragments that you generate Ionic Traces, and Ions has a 10-second cooldown each time. The aspect Touch of Thunder will allow Pulse Grenades to generate an Ionic Trace with every pulse, and Warlocks can generate a ton of Ionic Traces using Electrostatic Mind. When eliminating an Arc debuffed target, it generates an Ionic Trace. As for exotics, there is no exotic armor piece that can generate Ionic Traces, and there are only 2 weapons that can. Coldheart, which will generate traces every 2 seconds once it reaches max damage, and the other is Delicate Tomb, where final blows have a chance to generate Ionic Traces. Which doesn't really leave a whole lot of build options for Ionic Traces without the artifact, but if you build into it correctly, they can be extremely powerful. So yeah, that's the fundamentals of the Arc subclass. I know this has been a little bit of a long one, and I hope you found it useful in some way. Now you can take this better understanding of the subclass verbs and start crafting your own builds by looking at the fragments and which ones synergize with each of the buffs and debuffs that you want to use. If you do come up with any build, send it my way. I'm happy to test them. I always find it fun to just run content with something new. But if there's something you still don't understand, leave a comment or come join the Discord and ask away. I'm always happy to help where I can. And just a reminder that if I've made any mistakes, let me know in the comments, because I don't like to leave misinformation in my videos. As for what's next in Subclass series, I'm planning to do Solar, which is to this day my favourite subclass in the entire game, mainly thanks to how satisfying an Ignition is. So stay tuned for that. And if you're still here, right to the end, just know that I really appreciate you. Thanks very much for watching, and as always, have a wonderful rest of your day.